Can you all hear me in the back? Eric? Alrighty. We're working on it, I heard. Okay? How's that? Is Mike mic'd?
Not yet.
Okay.
Patience.
Patience. Am I on? No. I think you'll find it to be very, very worthwhile. I want to remind you that we have a couple of other programs coming up that you might want to get on your calendar. Sunday, June the 8th, we'll be having a program talking about Kairos, Palestine and Kairos, USA. That's Sunday, June the 8th, and we'll get more information. It's still in its embryonic stages, but I know it will be here at Plymouth Church, and we'll get the time and the information out to you soon. Then in the fall, we're really excited about our fall program. I'll just mention two of the things in the fall. Number one, the film The People and the Olive. It chronicles the 2012 run across Palestine. American and Palestinian athletes run about 120 miles from Hebron to Jenin in support of olive farmers. So we're going to watch a film on that, and then that's Thursday, September 11th, and then on Saturday, September 13th, we have a concert by Joshua Davis, a young man. Both the producer of the film and the concert are both by young Jewish fellows. Josh, who's going to perform the concert, participated in the run, and it so moved him that, thank you, John. It so moved him. It so moved him that he wrote a number of pieces of music, and so he will be performing in concert on Saturday, September the 13th. So that's a real good point-counterpoint with the film and then the concert. And then we're very excited in October the 25th, Saturday, October the 25th is our annual gala. And you know, we really like to find someone who really has been a world changer. We've had Arun Gandhi in the past, and Dali Ashkenazi Landau, Mike Farrell. We have Dr. Alan Busak. Alan is from the Christian Reform movement in South Africa. He marched alongside of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, and it was he was the first who pushed for the coining of the term apartheid from a church denomination in South Africa. And so he's going to come and talk about his work in South Africa, but also how it applies to the Israel-Palestinian situation. So that's Saturday, October the 25th, and we're just really delighted. He's a world figure, and we're really excited about inviting Alan to Fort Wayne. So we've got if you're not on our email list, there's an opportunity for you to put yourself on our email list out at our table in the Folsom Room. So please, as you depart for some sweets and treats and to talk with Brant after the program tonight over in the Folsom Room, if you're not on our email list and getting our emails that tell you about our programs, please make sure you get on our list so that we can keep you informed. Before I introduce you, Brant, I'm going to turn it over to John Gardner, pastor at Plymouth Church, to say a word of welcome. John.
Well, just on behalf of the members and friends of Plymouth Congregational Church of Fort Wayne United Church of Christ, I bid you welcome and greetings to our gathering this evening. We oftentimes say here, for those who may be visiting for the first time, that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. We don't always attain the spirit that we would desire, but our hope is very, very great. That this would be a place where people are comfortable regardless of their where they are on life's journey. So it's a special treat also, Rabbi Rosen, to welcome you. Every day, we say, every day is a day to pray for peace. And so we are all blessed by peacemakers. And we thank you for your work and your witness. If there's anything that I can do to make your stay here to extend a welcome, speak with me, and I'll try to find somebody. If I can't help, somebody will be available. Thank you.
Well, as I say, we're just really delighted to be welcoming Rabbi Rosen. You've been on my radar screen since you sent out the first send button on your blog and your book and all the rest. So Brant, it really is a personal delight as well as a delight for Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. As you know, Rabbi Rosen's presence here is sponsored by Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. Our mission is to educate, engage, and empower for justice, peace, and human rights, both here, locally, in the Middle East, and really around the globe. And so we're really happy that you all came out today as well. Rabbi Brant Rosen has been the spiritual leader of the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation in Evanston, Illinois since 1998. A graduate of UCLA and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Rabbi Rosen is the past president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and is the co-founder and co-chairperson of Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. Under your leadership, Rabbi JRC has received nationwide attention and the first platinum rating ever awarded to a house of worship by the United States Green Building Council. And in 2009, Rabbi Rosen was the recipient of Chicago Magazine's Green Award for his environmental leadership. Rabbi Rosen is also a longtime activist for peace, social justice, and human rights, and has traveled on delegations to such countries as the former Soviet Union, Nigeria, Rwanda, Uganda, and Iran. In 2010, he was awarded the Inspiration for Hope Award by the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, Chicago, for his activism on behalf of peace and justice in the Middle East. Rabbi Rosen's writings appear regularly in his blog, Shalom Rav, and has contributed to such media outlets as the Chicago Tribune, the Huffington Post, and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, among others. His book, Wrestling in the Daylight, was published by Just World Books in 2012. By the way, the subtitle of Wrestling in the Daylight is A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity. And it really is a collection, right? An anthology, a collection of his blog postings, but also the responses that he received from folks, both, I'm assuming from your congregation, but also just all around, really, the world. And many of them are positive, and many of them are not positive. And we see Rabbi Rosen's dialogical encounter with these various responses. In 2008, Rabbi Rosen was honored by Newsweek magazine as one of the top 25 pulpit rabbis in America. He lives in Evanston with his wife and his two sons. And although you just told us that the one son's not there and the other one's leaving, so you're going to be an empty nester soon. So anyway, it's my real delight to welcome you, Brant, and to introduce you to this wonderful group of folks today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael, for that very, can people hear me okay? For that very gracious introduction. Wow, I sound very impressive. I'll have to stick with that nice long bio. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and especially to thank the Indiana Center and Michael and the members of the board of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace for a very gracious invitation and hosting of me since I've been here. I also want to extend my thanks to Pastor John and to Plymouth Congregational Church for hosting us tonight. And I've been looking forward to this visit for a long time. I really hope our evening will be one of conversation. As Pastor John mentioned, whatever brings you here, I honor that. Wherever you are on your journey, wherever you are on your struggling with this particular issue, it's very important to me not simply to share my experience and opinions, but really to engage in conversation. And sometimes, not sometimes, almost always, I think the most fruitful parts of a conversation come out of those tension points, out of the places where we don't have agreement. And whether you agree with what I have to say or not, I look forward to having that conversation and that exploration with all of you. I'd like to begin by just reading briefly from the introduction, the very beginning of the introduction of my book, to give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. I guess it's the preface. I begin, and this is also explains why I chose the title for the book that I did. I begin with a verse from Genesis 32:25, a very famous episode in the book of Genesis. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. This well-known biblical episode leaves behind tantalizing questions. Who is this mysterious man with whom Jacob wrestles? What is his identity, and where did he come from? One popular interpretation suggests that the night stranger with whom Jacob wrestles at this critical moment is none other than Jacob himself, perhaps his alter ego or his shadow self. But why must the wrestling match necessarily take place at night? Why does the night stranger say so desperately to Jacob in the next verse, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking"? Perhaps this detail is teaching us that our deepest struggles invariably occur in the most private of places. After all, whenever we publicly wrestle with our deepest dilemmas, doubts, or fears, we take a very real risk. That's why we tend to engage in our most challenging struggles internally, in the dead of night. This book is, among other things, a record of the moment I personally began to wrestle in the daylight. It documents a 2-year period during which I publicly struggled as a congregational rabbi with one of the most difficult and painfully divisive issues facing the American Jewish community. So I wanted to say, to begin, just a little bit about my own background and what brings me here and brings me to this work. I'm from Southern California originally. I grew up in Los Angeles and Santa Monica, and I grew up in what I would call a relatively ordinary, mainstream Jewish suburban family. My family belonged to a Reformed temple, and we were very active in that temple growing up. And like many Jewish families, we identified very strongly with Israel. We identified as Zionists, and I remember visiting the first time to Israel when I was quite young, in 1974. I was about 8 or 9. And I've visited many, many times since. We have family members there. I have many dear friends who live in Israel. And for, I'd say, all of my adult life, I would say I identified profoundly with the state of Israel and all that it represents. Like many Jews, the Israel narrative is a very powerful one. It's a redemptive narrative. It's not too difficult to understand why it has such power for Jews when you think about it. This is a narrative of a people who are living in exile for thousands of years and living often in situations of persecution, and then following one of the moments of perhaps their greatest persecution during the Holocaust in Europe. Out of the ashes of that experience, they were reborn. They rebuilt their ancient homeland in a modern context, and were living as the Hatikva, the national anthem, would have it, Am Choshi Be'artzenu, as a free people in our own land. I mean, it's a redemptive story, and it has a very real power. Even for Jews, I think, who don't consider themselves particularly religious, I often would observe that I think it has a kind of religious power for Jews. And that was certainly the case for me. When I was in college and rediscovering my Judaism in my own way and on my own terms, Israel was a very big part of that. And I ended up living in Israel for 2 years. which was a very important spiritual turning point in my life. And it was also a time in which I started to think possibly about becoming a rabbi as a career. I would just define myself, because just saying a Zionist doesn't really complete the picture. There's many ways to be a Zionist. There are many forms of Zionism. And I've always been on the progressive end of the spectrum, what you would call today a liberal Zionist, which means that, well, for me, what that meant was I identified very strongly with the labor Zionist movement. I lived on a kibbutz for most of those 2 years when I was there in the early 1980s. I identified very strongly with the peace movement in Israel and was always a very strong proponent of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and in particular pursuing a two-state solution to this conflict. That I really understood that this was a conflict, as I saw it, as a conflict between two national peoples, both of which who have a claim, a legitimate claim, a compelling claim to the same piece of land. And that the only way to solve this conflict would be to find a way to share this land, two states for two peoples. And I'm old enough that I remember very well when even suggesting a two-state solution was in the Jewish community really pushing the envelope, if not even beyond the pale in some quarters. Today, it's very different. Today, the two-state solution is really the mainstream position in the Jewish community. But I remember well that talking about peace in this way in the 70s and 80s was a very edgy thing to be doing. So I identified, though, given all of that, I believed very powerfully in the Israel narrative as I described it to you, and was even considered moving to Israel for a period of time when I was younger. I would also say that during this time, I would entertain certain challenges to that narrative, and certain voices, in the back of my head, if you will, voices in the non-clinical sense of the term. I would challenge the narrative, but always sort of do my best to sort of vanquish those voices usually by the words, well, it's very complicated. I think that's something that I think we all do psychologically. I think whenever we find ourselves in challenging situations, really challenging ourselves to the core, we can sort of retreat with the words, well, it's very, very complicated. And it's a way of sort of escaping some, I think, looking back, some realities that really, at the end of the day, aren't really that complicated. So for instance, I remember very well in the 1980s, in the mid to late 80s, was really the beginning in which the works of new Israeli historians were being published in English. And these were historians like Benny Morris and Tom Segev and Avi Shleim and Ilan Pape and others. These were very famous Israeli historians who at the time were researching, in particular, the circumstances around the birth of the State of Israel and the events of, specifically the events around 1947-48, and challenging the traditional Jewish narrative, the traditional Zionist narrative, I should say, on how Israel was created. The traditional conventional narrative had been, and this was the one I learned growing up, that the Jews started to come to Palestine in the 19th century when the Zionist movement was created by Theodor Herzl, and Palestinians were opposed to their being there, and there was tension, and the Jews wanted to be able to share the land with the Palestinians, but the Palestinians resisted Jewish settlement, and eventually the British washed their hands of the situation. Following World War I, the British had a mandate over historic Palestine, and as the 20th century went along, they washed their hands of it, handed it over to the UN, who came up with the partition plan. The Zionists, the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Israel, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted partition. The Arabs rejected it, and there was a battle for independence. The Jewish community in Palestine was attacked by Palestinians and by Arab countries on all sides, and they miraculously won, and created this land. And the Palestinians, for their part, were told by Arab countries that they should leave their homes, that the Arab governments would send in their armies, take care of the Jewish community there, and they'd be able to return, and the Palestinians were, in that way, seen as a victim of the Arab countries. The truth of the matter, as we've learned it from these Israeli historians who were studying newly declassified military documents, among other things, really primary sources about the events of 1947-48 were not quite as cut and dried as that. And in particular, many of these histories showed that these lands were, the lands of historic Palestine were ethnically cleansed, for lack of a better term, of their indigenous population. In many ways, this was a planned operation on the part of Israel, the early state of Israel. There was, in fact, a transfer committee that was formed to investigate these Arab villages and the populated cities in which Palestinians lived, and there was a very concerted effort to drive Palestinians from their homes, and which happened at the end of 47 and through 48. Arab countries didn't really engage in the fight until well into 1948. By that time, the Yishuv had the upper hand in the battle, and after they left, most of these villages, almost all of these villages were completely razed to the ground, and they were not allowed to return. It was created, in other words, the way most nations are created, on the backs of its indigenous people. And it was, I think, devastating for many to read these books. I know it was for me, because it went against everything that I had read and I had come to understand about the creation of the State of Israel and the beginning of the conflict between Jews and Palestinians. At the same time, I also entertained doubts about this notion of a Jewish state. And these were particularly troubling to me. You know, it's often been said, and it's still said, that it's important. The importance of a Palestinian state is largely not only because the Palestinians deserve a state of their own, but because they represent a demographic threat to the quote-unquote to the Jewish state of Israel. In other words, a Jewish state, the maintenance of a Jewish state is predicated and depends on a demographic Jewish majority in the land. That was always the problem in the Zionist movement, was how are we going to create the numbers that would be able to make possible an ethnically Jewish state. And I remember thinking, you know, periodically, we would talk about, well, you know, the demographic threat against the integrity of a Jewish state, and that the Palestinians, the birth rate of Palestinians in particular, which was outpacing the Jewish birth rate, meant that there was this demographic imbalance that would have to be addressed. And I remember thinking, as an American, I would never dare talk about other ethnic groups that lived in the United States as a demographic threat to the integrity of the nation of the United States of America. Right? That would be considered just plain racist to say something like that, right? But as a Jew, and even a liberal Jew, even a progressive Jew, to regard the presence of non-Jews as somehow a demographic problem to be dealt with was always, I think, you know, periodically along the way, you know, as I really started to unpack that, really troubling. But again, I would always sort of retreat to, well, it's complicated. It's complicated. A two-state solution would take care of that demographic balance. So the other, I guess, the final piece, the final little voice that I did my best to vanquish over the years was just the issue of militarism in general. I've always been, and this is something I think I received from my own family, very involved in the peace movement. One way or another, and identified very strongly with the peace movement, and have always been very, very comfortable taking a very direct stand against American militarism around the world, whether it was Vietnam in the 70s, or whether it's you know, Iraq more recently, or you know, any number of militaristic adventures that our government has embarked upon over the years. it's come very naturally to me to protest, and to protest the spread of militarism in general, and the spread of the nuclear threat throughout the world. And yet when it came to Israeli militarism, Israel would always sort of get a pass. And this is a phenomenon we see in the Jewish community, which is still, on balance, quite left-leaning. All of the values that I applied to my country and countries around the world just did not apply to Israel. But in fact, Israel is a very highly militarized country. By a recent study, in fact, looking at countries around the world per capita in terms of the amount they spend of their GNP on military expenditures, Israel is the most militarized country in the world. And militarism is just a way of life. You can't be in Israel and not see it. Seeing soldiers carrying M16s sitting next to you on the bus becomes commonplace. It's often very abrupt for people who are visiting for the first time, but if you spend any length of time there, it's just part of the fabric of life. And it never allowed it to disturb me in quite the way that militarism in general disturbed me. But again, I would say, well, it's complicated. It's somehow a different situation. So I did my best to sort of keep those voices at bay. In the meantime, I became a rabbi. I went to rabbinical school and decided to become a congregational rabbi. And when I did, I graduated from rabbinical school in 1992. That obviously changed the stakes for me. I mean, my opinions about Israel weren't just my opinions about Israel anymore. They carried weight. They were very public. I had congregants and community members looking to me to help them make sense of this conflict, which is so front and center in the Jewish world and the world in general. And I think during the course of the 90s, I still identified very strongly as a liberal Zionist and was involved in various causes, but little by little I can see, looking back, I was going through a great deal of anguish about what was going on in that part of the world, and a sinking feeling in my own mind. And so really, I think for a good part of my rabbinate, I really dealt with the issue through avoidance. I didn't really engage it with any real depth. I would talk about, just generally the importance of peace, and we all should get along, and we should pursue a two-state solution. And as each incarnation of the peace process would unfold, each time I would have greater and greater doubts about just not only the possible success of the peace process, but just the inherent balance and justice of the peace process itself. I would really keep those doubts to myself, and little by little did my best to keep those voices in the back. Looking back, I think there was a real turning point. I visited the West Bank, and really visited the West Bank for the first time in 2007, and saw things up close that I had never seen before. And I had visited Israel many, many times before, but I had never spent any length of time in the West Bank, in refugee camps, talking with Palestinians, going to Hebron, for instance, and seeing literally segregated sidewalks where Arabs were not allowed to walk. It was actually a trip that was sponsored by Brit Tzedek B'Shalom, which was a liberal Zionist organization that was a prototype of J Street, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and also Meretz, which was an Israeli left progressive party. And it was really, the trip was designed for Americans to come to the territories and impress upon them the importance of recommitting to the peace process. But it had the opposite effect on me, looking back. It just filled me with despair. I didn't see how any peace process, as it was currently defined, could address the incredible inequity that I saw on the ground. And then alongside that was the blockade in Gaza, the very, very dire situation in Gaza after Hamas came to power, and this blockade was imposed by Israel and Egypt, and the dire situation that was facing the 1.5 million people who were crammed into that tiny sliver of land. I actually did sign which was pretty out there for me at the time, a collective interfaith statement condemning the blockade on Gaza and calling for Israel to engage with the Hamas regime. both with ceasefires and in a broader sense. And then, really the breaking point, or the final turning point for me, was in December 2008. And that was with Operation Cast Lead, which was, I'm sure, an event that many of you, if not all of you, remember well. It was Israel's military incursion into, incursion is a polite way of putting it, military attack on Gaza. It began with great ferocity. I remember at the end of December 2008, I was reading the initial reports of the attacks in Gaza City in the north, and just going numb. I remember thinking, I can't continue to dance around this anymore. I can't continue to apologize for it or to explain it away or to say, it's very complicated. It just didn't seem very complicated anymore. And I really, I think, realized what was going on. And it was at that moment, really, that it was the beginning of my shift of the narrative that I had been cherishing for my life up until that point. So I had been writing this blog. I started writing it in 2006, so I'd been writing it for about 2 years. And up until that point, it was a nice blog. I wrote about all kinds of different things. I would often write about issues of social justice that I was involved in and that were important to me. And it was mainly a way for me, primarily, at least at the beginning, to keep in touch with my congregation. This was still back when blogging is sort of passé these days, I think. But this is back in the heyday of blogging. And it was a wonderful, I found it wonderful, I still find it a wonderful mechanism for communicating with folks. I just read these reports, I sat down and wrote out a very quick blog post. I just expressed what was on my mind in that moment. And I remember showing it to my wife, Hallie, and I said, well, what do you think? Should I send it? And she said, well, this is what you feel. You should speak your conscience. And so I sent it, and that was sort of what sort of shifted everything for me in all kinds of ways. And I'll read to you the blog post. December 28th, 2008, I entitled it, Outrage in Gaza, No More Apologies. The news today out of Israel and Gaza makes me just sick to my stomach. I know, I can already hear your responses. Every nation has a responsibility to ensure the safety of its citizens. If the Qassams stopped, the Qassam rockets stopped, Israel wouldn't be forced to take military action. Hamas also bears responsibility for this tragic situation. I could answer each and every one of these claims in turn, but I'm ready to stop this perverse game of rhetorical ping-pong. I don't buy the rationalizations anymore. I'm so tired of the apologetics. How on earth will squeezing the life out of Gaza, not to mention bombing the living hell out of it, ensure the safety of Israeli citizens? We good liberal Jews are ready to protest oppression and human rights abuses anywhere in the world, but are all too willing to give Israel a pass. It's a fascinating double standard, and one I understand all too well. I understand it because I've been just as responsible as anyone else for perpetrating it. So no more rationalizations. What Israel has been doing to the people of Gaza is an outrage. It has brought neither safety nor security to the people of Israel, and it has brought nothing but misery and tragedy upon the people of Gaza. There, I've said it. Now what do I do? And that last question actually was sort of misinterpreted at the time. A lot of the comments I got many, many comments to this blog post. There were people who were telling me, well, this is what you should do. You should sign this petition, you should march in this rally, and they gave me all kinds of practical advice about what I should do. When really I meant the question as a much more existential question. I was really saying, well, what do I do now? Where do I stand? How can I be a Jew and feel these things or say these things? Can I be a rabbi? Do I still have a congregation? It was really just sort of this moment where I just openly and honestly wrestled in the daylight, as it were. I just expressed what was on my mind and put it out there, just sent it off. And what happened was really interesting. I got back just a slew of responses. It kind of went viral. And I got back more responses. I think even today, I think it's the most responses I've ever gotten for a blog post. It was between 150 and 200 responses, which for my modest little blog was a lot. But what was also interesting were the responses themselves. I mean, there were definitely those, and I include them in the book, and for the other blog posts as well, people who just violently disagreed with me. And there were people, but there were many Jews who wrote back and saying, thank you for saying this. It means so much to me to have a rabbi saying this. I've been waiting for a rabbi or a Jewish leader to say these things. I thought I was going crazy having these thoughts. And then there were some comments in between, like, well, that's interesting. What do you mean? I'd like to know more about how you feel about what's going on. And then every day more and more comments came, and then people started talking to one another, which was really interesting. And I sort of opened up this online, chat room where people were sort of in the relative, transparency of the internet, were having a conversation. Many of them were my congregants. Many of them were people who I knew. But most of them were people I have not met and still haven't met, although many of them have become familiar to me over the years as regular visitors on the blog. And that opened up a whole conversation, and I found it very heartening, actually. That was the one thing that gave me hope, was that we could find a way to talk about this together. Over the course of Operation Cast Lead, it went well into January, as many of you know, and it expanded in just terrifying and tragic and horrible ways. And in the end, there were scores of Gazans killed. By the estimates differ, but somewhere around 1,400 people killed, 300 of whom were children. There were scores of injured. Israel used white phosphorus, this chemical that burns you literally down to the bone. And we're dropping these tons of bombs on this tiny little, territory that was blockaded, where 1.5 million people were literally imprisoned and nowhere to run. And I was in great anguish over this, and I wrote more and more about what was going on during Operation Cast Lead, and more people joined that conversation. In my congregation, it raised all kinds of dust, as you might imagine, and the dust continues to swirl around to this day, many years later. But to my great pleasure and relief, the leadership of my congregation was very brave then and now. And I think many other congregations, probably most other congregations, would have said, well, I'm sorry, you're just causing too much heat. I think any other congregation would have given me my walking papers. But their attitude from the beginning, the president, the board, and many of the lay leaders was, wow, okay, so we have a situation here. Let's figure this out. How are we going to deal with this? And we started, just like on the internet, I started a conversation. We worked to create opportunities for people to talk together about their feelings and create a safe space, because needless to say, I have many congregants who don't agree with my views on Israel. I have some who do. I have some who, the way I'd like to describe it is I have a small number of congregants who love and say what I do on this issue and have been waiting for a rabbi to say and do these things. I have a small group on the other end, small but pretty vocal, and many longtime members of the congregation who are horribly upset by what I say and do on this issue, and wish I would shut up, and it pains them greatly. And then the largest number, I think, in the middle are people who agree with some things, disagree with others. Maybe this isn't their primary issue, and so it's not as of deep concern to them, but they're willing to engage in it and want to learn more, and some of them wish I would rant and rave about other issues that are near and dear to their hearts. But all of them support me as their rabbi, which is just such a gift to me, that they understand, I think, that a central part of any clergy's job is speaking his or her conscience and being a bearer of that conscience in the world. So the long and short of it is that I continue to do this work, and the book is really an anthology, as Michael mentioned, of those blog posts and many of the reactions. What it ended up doing for me was Gaza was just sort of a tipping point. In other words, my issue was not just about Gaza, although I focused on Gaza. A rabbinic colleague of mine, Rabbi Brant Rosen, and I founded an initiative called Jewish Fast for Gaza at the time. And we tried to get other rabbis involved with us, which which we were able to do. A small number. There were many who wanted to join but just couldn't for their own professional reasons. But at the same time, my work expanded from there. Gaza was just, as I put it in the book, the domino. It tipped all the dominoes. That all those voices that I had locked away, I just let them out. And over time, and you can see in the book, I gained sort of the courage of my convictions to speak more openly about what I'm feeling. And by the end of the book, I'll read that at the end of my remarks to you, I'm really able to call myself someone who stands with the Palestinian people, solidarity with the Palestinian people. And when people ask me, well, what are you? Are you a Zionist? Are you anti-Zionist? Are you, where do you stand? I say I'm a Palestinian solidarity activist. That's the best way I know how to describe myself. And by that does not mean that I have abandoned the Jewish people or even Israelis. But I do believe that my spiritual tradition demands that I stand with the oppressed and the vulnerable and the marginalized, and I do that in all areas, and Israel-Palestine should be no different. And in Israel-Palestine, we have a people who are being oppressed. I don't know any other way to put it. And it pains me to say those words out loud. But my old liberal Zionist paradigm of, two peoples with the same claims on the same piece of land, with their own national claims on the same piece of land, did not work for me anymore. I don't see this as a balanced equation. And I don't really see this about land, per se. I see this about human rights. This is really a rights-based conflict, not a land-based conflict. And right now we have a situation where there's one people who have rights and one people who don't, both within Israel and in the occupied territories. And until it's not, we can divide up, the land can be divided up any which way, and may well be eventually. But until we address the very dire situation on the ground right now of human rights abuse, we're not going to come up with a peace that is a lasting just peace. I believe that in my heart. And if my tradition demands that I stand with the oppressed, that means not only undocumented immigrants who are being detained and deported in the west side of Chicago, or workers in a hotel who are being intimidated by their owners because they're trying to unionize, but it also means Palestinians who are being oppressed by Israel, which is a vastly more powerful party in this conflict. It's not a balanced conflict. So I have gotten involved now at this point in what I see as a large and important and growing popular movement of solidarity with Palestinians, and it includes many Jews, growing numbers of Jews, as well as Palestinians, as well as Christians and other peoples of conscience. I think a centerpiece of this movement is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, which is something we can talk about during discussion if you're interested in talking about it more. I learned about and started writing about BDS in 2009, which was when it was still sort of off the radar screen of the Jewish community and most of the American community. It's very front and center now. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently spoke at the AIPAC convention and spent most of his time talking about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which means that it must be succeeding if it's become that, if it's gaining that much attention by Israeli politicians and by Jewish communal establishment leaders as well. I do believe that this is a very important part of this movement. I think it's an incredibly vital way of showing our solidarity, and not just speaking our solidarity, but acting on it. And it is part of a time-honored tradition of popular resistance, of civil disobedience and nonviolent, inherently nonviolent resistance to garner people power, to leverage people power, to shift political power. It's often accused of being delegitimizing, quote unquote, or anti-Semitic. I believe those are canards. I don't believe it's any of those things. I believe it's much more in the tradition of the boycotts that we saw in this country during the civil rights movement, whether it's the Montgomery boycott or what have you. I think it's much more along the lines of the global movement of BDS against apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. I think it's a legitimate form of popular resistance. If the political elites are unable to do what they need to do to create a more just solution to this conflict, history has shown that popular movements can rise up to push political power to do what's necessary. I was saying to a group of folks earlier today that if you look at this country, when Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, he didn't do it in 1964 because he was a great lover of civil rights. He did it because there was a huge popular movement that had been amassing outside on the streets for decades leading up to that point, that were pushing him and other politicians to the place where they were able to have the political cover to take these stands and to make these political changes. And the same, I think, you can absolutely see the same thing going on in other examples as well around the world. So I do believe that BDS is an important part of this movement. But another important part is simply doing what we're doing here, and that's just educating ourselves about widening the parameters of what is considered acceptable discourse on this issue. I try to do that in the Jewish community, and I also try to do that in the greater community. I think many Christians of conscience are unfortunately, sadly silenced by the Jewish establishment and institutional world, who accuses Christians in particular of being anti-Semitic or delegitimizing when they raise these issues. I find that to be tragic, because I think Christians are stakeholders here as well. This is the Holy Land, not just for Jews. And I've learned a great deal from my Christian brothers and sisters on how to be faithful on this issue and how to find the courage of your convictions as well. So it's very important to me to work together and to speak with church groups around the country. I know that your group isn't specifically faith-based, but I know many of you are Christian, and we're speaking here in a church. And I think it's very important that our Jewish-Christian dialogue on this issue be grounded in an approach that goes to the uncomfortable places and not only sort of papers over the difficult stuff and celebrates all the lovely stuff we have in common. So that is the work that I've been doing up until now, and there's much more to say about it. I guess the second to last thing I'll say is, Michael mentioned this in his introduction of me, a very important institutional address for me has been Jewish Voice for Peace. And you know, when I wrote in my first blog post, well, now what do I do? One of the answers to that question was this remarkable organization, which actually after Operation Cast Lead gained many, many new Jewish members. Their ranks grew by leaps and bounds, actually, from about 2008, 2009, and beyond. There's now well over somewhere between 150 and 200,000 members. It's a membership organization, which is actually relatively unique in the Jewish institutional world. It's very grassroots in its approach. It has a board of directors that's elected democratically by all of its members. And it's really what I love about Jewish Voice for Peace and why I've been so honored to be part of it and to organize the rabbis, the JVP rabbis, in our rabbinical council, is because it is really, it goes back to what I was saying before, it takes a rights-based approach to this conflict. In other words, it doesn't take a stand on any kind of political parameters to the solution, whether it's one state, whether it's two state, whether people are Zionist or non-Zionist. What it is focused on is equal rights for all. And that whatever the political parameters of that solution will be, which frankly should be determined by the people who live in that country, Israelis and Palestinians, what it should be based on is international law, human rights, civil rights, and equity for everybody who lives there. I think the rights-based approach for me, I think, opens up whole new worlds for us in understanding the parameters of this issue and also ways to create coalition with other groups. I never fail to be amazed by the common cause I find with others who are part of this movement. And JVP is really, I think, an important Jewish component of this growing popular movement that I've been talking about. So I want to conclude with a blog post that I wrote exactly 1 year after that first one that I read. I wrote it on the first anniversary of Operation Cast Lead. and that year was quite a year for me. So I was sort of looking back. And it was December 28th, 2009, and it's entitled Gaza 1 Year Later, Beyond the Complications. It was exactly 1 year ago that I read the first news accounts of Israel's military assault in Gaza. And here I'm quoting from the New York Times article that I read that day. Waves of Israeli airstrikes destroyed Hamas security facilities in Gaza on Saturday in a crushing response to the group's rocket fire, killing more than 225, the highest one-day toll in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in decades. There was a shocking quality to Saturday's attacks, which began in broad daylight as police cadets were graduating, women were shopping at the outdoor market, and children were emerging from school. The center of Gaza City was a scene of chaotic horror, with rubble everywhere, sirens wailing, and women shrieking as dozens of mutilated bodies were laid out on the pavement and in the lobby of Shifa Hospital, so that family members could identify them. The dead included civilians, including several construction workers, and at least 2 children in school uniforms. By afternoon, shops were shuttered, funerals began, and mourning tents were visible on nearly every major street of this densely populated city. Previously, when I'd hear this kind of news out of Israel-Palestine, my shock and anguish would be quickly tempered by a familiar voice telling me to calm down, don't overreact, don't forget how terribly complicated the situation is. Indeed, I distinctly recall hearing that voice 3 years earlier when the IDF responded to Hezbollah rocket attacks with a similarly massive military onslaught. This time, though, it was different. This time, I didn't hear the voice. Somehow, it just didn't seem all that complicated to me anymore. Ideologically speaking, I've regarded Zionism with great pride as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Of course, I didn't deny that this rebirth had come at the expense of another people. Of course, I recognized that Israel's creation was bound up with the suffering of the Palestinians. The situation was, well, it was complicated. Last year, however, I reacted differently. I read of Apache helicopters dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on 1.5 million people crowded into a 140-square-mile patch of land with nowhere to run. In the coming days, I would read about the bombing of schools, whole families being blown to bits, children literally burned to the bone with white phosphorus. Somehow, it didn't seem complicated at all anymore. At long last, I felt as if I were viewing the conflict with something approaching clarity. Of course, I think we'd all agree that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is technically complicated. But at the end of the day, there is nothing complicated about persecution. The political situation in Darfur, for instance, is enormously complicated. But these complications certainly haven't stopped scores of Jews across North America from protesting the human rights injustices being committed there. We do so because we know that underneath all the geopolitical complexities, oppression is oppression. And as Jews, we know instinctively that our sacred tradition and our own tragic history require us to speak out against all oppression committed in our midst. I'd suggest that if there is anything complicated for us here, it is in the possibility that we might in fact have become oppressors ourselves. That is painfully complicated. After all, our Jewish identity has been bound up with the memory of our own persecution for centuries. How on earth can we comprehend, let alone respond, to the suggestion that we've become our own worst nightmare? More than anything else, what I was trying to say in that anguished, emotional blog post 1 year ago was, is this what it has come to? Have we come to the point where Israel can wipe out hundreds of people, whole families, whole neighborhoods, and our response as Jews will be simply to rationalize it away? At the very least, will we be able to stop and question what has brought us to this terrifying point? Have we become unable to recognize persecution for what it really and truly is? Those who know me or read my blog surely know that it has been a painfully challenging year for me. My own relationship to Israel is changing in ways I never could have predicted. Since I started raising questions like those above, I've lost some friends, and yes, my congregation has lost some members. If Zionism is the unofficial religion of the contemporary Jewish community, then I'm sure there are many who consider me something of an apostate. But at the same time, I've been surprised and encouraged by the large number of people I've met who've been able to engage with these questions openly and honestly, even if they don't always agree with me. I suppose this is what I decided to do 1 year ago, to put my faith in our ability to stand down the paralyzing complexities, however painful the prospect. 1 year ago, I still hold tight to this faith. Thank you. As I do in the book, I engage very directly with many of the commenters, and I would love to make this a conversation. That's really why I love doing these speaking gigs. So please feel free to share your thoughts. Just a few notes of civil discourse to please engage with one another and with myself civilly, and always make sure there's a question mark at the end of those sentences, and really make them I statements. I always prefer to engage in the content of the ideas rather than in the people who are addressing them. And I know we're all capable of that. That's why we're all here tonight. So we can go ahead and get started. Will?
Well, number one, thank you very much for being here. Your comments, an awful lot of what I agree with. And I would say that in many respects, it's easy to say what's right, what's wrong. And I don't disagree with your analysis. But getting out of that situation, I have found my analysis it is very complicated. How do you get out of that? And about a month ago, something hit me, and I thought it was sort of a unique idea, but it turns out that Amos Oz wrote about 6 or 8 years ago. And that is, why doesn't Israel say, we've won this war, let's help Palestine be what they ought to be. Create a Marshall Plan for Palestine. And let Israel lead them. I'm sure the United States would help. I'm sure other countries would help. But why wouldn't that be a strong, positive way? You could almost say you don't really even need any negotiations to do that. Just the basic understanding of, okay, there's going to be 2 states. We're not going to be at war forever. We want 20 years from now our children to be citizens of these 2 states, independent but connected. That will be strong, strong states on the eastern end of the Mediterranean.
So when you say a Marshall Plan, you mean Israel will come up with this plan?
Yes. Just do it. That's what we did after World War II. And you can say, my goodness gracious, how would we do that with Japan? Crying out loud, look what they did. Or Germany.
There's a big difference between post-World War II and Israel-Palestine. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I'll let you finish. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Okay. Well, first I'll back up a little bit. I think my problem with that, I think we need creative solutions and coming up with new, fresh ideas. And I honor your desire to think outside the box. I think that's exactly what we need. Personally, I don't think a plan like I wouldn't support a plan like that, because it basically means Israel is dictating all of the terms. All right, if Israel comes up with the terms and solves the problem for the Palestinians. The situation post-war in Europe was very different. We had sovereign states at war with one another. The situation in Israel-Palestine is we have one sovereign state that has been occupying one ethnic group within that country that has not been sovereign, and continues not to be sovereign. So it's not an equitable. We don't have 2 governments coming together in nearly the same way as we saw post World War II. I think part of the problem is Israel has been one that has been dictating the terms all along, and our country has been enabling Israel to do that. A Marshall Plan, to me, is just another fancy way of allowing Israel to dictate the terms. I think the answer has to be to empower Palestinians to take responsibility for their own lives and dictate terms on their terms, so that we have an equitable balance between the 2 parties. That's why I support the popular movement that's rising up, of which BDS is such an important part, that it's trying to shift the balance of power. Until we really address that inequity, I don't think we're going to see a peace that will hold, because justice isn't a part of it. You know, Israel is the party with all the power in the situation, and you know, Frederick Douglass had that very classic comment: "Power concedes nothing without a demand; it never has, and it never will." There's never been an example, as far as I know, in human history where a power, you know, as Amos Oz is suggesting, has just one day said, "All right, we're going to give up our power." It never happens. It doesn't happen that way. Power has to be pushed to give up power. It has to be demanded. So I think it's, realistically speaking, I don't think Israel will ever get to that point. It's not going down a road in which it shows any sign of a desire to give up power. But even if it did, as long as it's dictating the terms, then that's not a real peace. That's just continuing the power imbalance, in my opinion.
Rabbi Rosen again, welcome to Fort Wayne. Thank you very much for your talk. You've hit on, I think, two very essential points, and I have a question. The "it's complicated" statement is something that I always run into. As a Palestinian, as a Muslim, I don't see the fact that I haven't seen both my mom's parents for the past 25 years, and I couldn't be at their funeral last year, when both of them died within a year from each other. And unfortunately, their children couldn't be there to bury them properly in the ground, and we had to rely on other members of the family who are still in Gaza. But when we say it's complicated, or people say it's complicated, it's kind of pacifying our conscience and just saying, we'll let the political powers deal with it and argue about it. But I think you brought in an extremely important point, which is conversations. And the conversations between the people talking about these stories and raising the question of human rights issues. But the complicating part is when I talk about Zionism and I get well, you're just being anti-Semitic. Or the fear of, and especially within the Christian community, the fear of being labeled as anti-Semite, or the fear of, as Mark Braverman mentioned in his book, of letting down the Jewish people yet again. And the separation between Zionism and Judaism is becoming very blurred. So how do you engage, or can you give tools to the common folk, our people, just talking to each other? How can you approach that subject without it being just dead-ended right there by saying, well, you're just being anti-Semitic, or it's complicated?
Right.
Thank you.
Right. You know, I'll qualify what I'm about to say by saying that sometimes you're going to come up with against people who just have no desire to engage in real dialogue and are never going to be convinced to have a real dialogue, no matter how convincing you are. And I am of the opinion, increasingly, that it's a waste of time and energy to have those conversations. So that's my qualification. I do believe in conversation, but only with people who are really interested in real conversation. I think sometimes these conversations that devolve into spitting matches actually end up being counterproductive in so many ways and just add to the complication, if you will. But in a real, genuine, good faith conversation, I would really challenge people when they say that's anti-Semitic to define their terms and to really explain, you know, what they mean by anti-Semitic, and point out that in civil discourse, you really need to engage in ideas and not name-calling, to engage in the issues and not personal attacks. And by calling someone an anti-Semite, what you're doing is shutting down, you're trying to, it's sort of a scorched earth approach to dialogue. You're shutting down any hope at real dialogue. So let's hold off on the name-calling and unpack what you mean when you're calling me an anti-Semite. What does that mean to you? Why is Zionism, opposing Zionism or criticizing Zionism, or even the policy of the State of Israel, according to some, anti-Semitic? What is your definition of anti-Semitism then? I mean, I would point out, and I've been doing this a great deal and writing more increasingly about this, that it's very important to remember historically that Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism is a political movement that arose in the 19th century in Europe. That term was coined specifically for a specific political movement that had a specific political agenda that was, in its origin, antinomian to the Jewish community. In other words, it was a dissident movement in the Jewish community. It was in opposition to centuries of Jewish thought and Jewish approach of this diaspora-based movement that believed in creating this peoplehood all around the world, and looked at the creation of the state of Israel. Religiously speaking, Judaism for centuries said that the Jews would return to that land as a sovereign people when the Messiah came, but any attempt to force the hand of the Messiah was seen as idolatrous, was seen as an anathema. And Zionism was a political movement, there were religious Jews and there were forms of religious Zionism, but the Zionist movement was an inherently political movement that sought to overturn centuries of what it meant to be Jewish for a specifically political agenda. So that's a piece that needs to be entered into the mix. I think it's also important to point out that from its origin there were many non-Zionists who were part of the Jewish community who were protesting. The most important example of that probably is the Reform movement, which was one of the largest American Jewish denominations of its time. It's the largest now, and was explicitly anti-Zionist. The Pittsburgh Platform in the late 19th century, if you Google it and read it, was a disavowal of the Zionist movement and saying that Judaism is a faith, it's about universal values of peace and brotherhood, and we do not seek to recreate a Jewish sovereign state in historic Palestine. So this was a debate that was going on in the Jewish community for many, many years. And it's only relatively recently that Judaism and Zionism have become conflated in the ways that you're describing. So I think those are important historical points to shine a light on, and to hear what they have to say. When people say things like, for centuries Jews have yearned to return to their state, to return to the land of Israel and create a state, and Zionism is just continuing in that tradition. I don't believe that's true. It was always a spiritual notion of return. It was always a messianic end of days return. It was never about creating a sovereign Jewish nation state as it's understood. Even the concept of Jewish nation statism is a modern concept. It arose after the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. So how can you say for 2,000 years Jews have been seeking to do this? These are historical and sort of philosophical points that I think are really important to bring up. We can debate them, we can discuss them, but to shut them down as inherently anti-Semitic is just disingenuous. And it's very difficult as a Christian or as a Muslim to argue these points, because especially with Jews who will say, well, you just don't understand Judaism. So I definitely sympathize with that. And I think it's important. It's important to engage in these conversations with good faith and point out that there are many Jews of conscience like Mark Raverman and Rabbi Brant Rosen and others, many, many more, who share these ideas as well.
This is not really my question. We talked about this, but Rabbi Rosen gets to this question that I wanted him to help me, his explanations in his blog. Why should we, with all the odious regimes in the world that are having human rights violations, why should we signal out Israel for BDS? Right?
So this goes back to the question about anti-Semitism. You often hear that the opponents of BDS will point out that it's anti-Semitic, that it's delegitimizing, that it's singling out Israel among all the odious countries and nations of the world for action. When there are many other countries doing just the same or far worse things, and why are we singling out Israel? That's a double standard, and that's anti-Semitic. The first thing I would say to that is I think it's a misunderstanding of what BDS is, and I didn't mention this earlier. BDS was a call that came from the Palestinian people. BDS was a call from the civil society, a huge number, over 150 civil society organizations, labor unions, and NGOs, and what have you, in the Palestinian civil society that came together and called for, was asking for support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel in the furtherance of three basic goals: for the end of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and recognition of Palestinian right of return. That's the BDS call, and it's coming from Palestine, and they are putting that call out to the world. It's a misunderstanding of BDS when we say we are just singling out Israel. We're not singling out Israel. We're responding to a call from Palestinians. There may be other calls from other civil societies of oppressed peoples around the world, and if there are, there's a Tibetan boycott. There's some groups that are calling for a boycott of China because of what's going on in Tibet. There may be other examples of that well, and they're absolutely worthy of our consideration. But the real question is why are we not looking at other odious regimes? The real question is, Palestinians have put this call before us. Will we respond to that call or not? That's really the question. If we consider this call legitimate, then we have a responsibility to respond to it in some fashion. And there are many campaigns which we can join and become part of that allow us to become part of that movement. So this is not singling out Israel. This is responding to a Palestinian call in good faith. The other thing you often hear is, for Jews have and we have, I think rightfully so, the whole issue of boycotts is a bit of a hot button for us. It dates back to, we can come up with lots of different examples, but the Nazi boycott of the Jewish community in the 1930s. You often hear that invoked by the Jewish establishment world today. They say this is just, boycotts are horrible, horrible things, and it's just like the Nazi boycott against the Jewish community, but in the 21st century. And that is just such an offensive and disingenuous comparison. The Nazi boycott was a boycott by a government, by a sovereign government against a minority that lived in its midst, right? The Palestinian call for BDS is a call that is coming out from a people who are being oppressed and are seeking their liberation, who are seeking support in their struggle. It's an inherently different kind of boycott. It's much more akin to the Montgomery bus boycott, for instance, that I mentioned before, that came out of the civil rights movement, where we had, once again, an oppressed people who were calling for solidarity. You may remember that Northerners went down to the South to participate in these actions, and they were called, outside infiltrators and people who were mixing in. And you often hear that about people who are supporting BDS, that these are outside agitators. These aren't outside agitators. These are people responding to a call for liberation. So it's an inherently different kind of phenomenon than God forbid, what happened in Nazi Germany. And that kind of comparison must be rejected and pointed out. The disingenuous of it must be pointed out at all costs. BDS is part of a time-honored tradition of nonviolent resistance to the abuse of power. And the question is, do we think it's valid to sign on to this one or not?
I asked that question at another meeting that I was at, hearing a speaker that was sponsored by the Jewish Federation, and I asked about the boycott, specifically the SodaStream boycott, and they didn't miss a beat. They came right back and said SodaStream is employing Palestinians at a living wage, and Palestinians don't want you to boycott. They don't want SodaStream to shut down. They didn't miss a beat. They just came that fast.
So I'd be happy to send you all kinds of links with information. Yeah, and
but I'm
right. Oh, they're always going to have an answer. They're always going to have an answer. And I don't think our job is to convince the Jewish Federation of the wrongness of its point of view, or to win any kind of pedagogic argument with the Jewish Federation. That's a losing battle. I wouldn't engage in that conversation. They have their agenda, and they have their talking points, and they're going to stick to it. And I just think I would rather spend much more time gaining more adherence to the SodaStream boycott than arguing with the Jewish Federation about it. I think rather than get involved in spitting matches, we should be building this movement. That's the best response. Absolutely. The SodaStream boycott to me is a no-brainer. I mean, it calls itself a product of Israel, and it's built in occupied territory. You know, the argument to me, the argument of, well, it's giving lovely, wonderful jobs to these, you know, these specific Palestinians, totally disregards the fact that these specific Palestinians live in an overall context of oppression, where their freedom of movement, their control over them at every step is controlled by Israel. So the answer to this oppression is not giving a good job and a good wage to individual Palestinians. The answer to the question is taking down that system of oppression. That's really the sort of the argument of the colonial noblesse oblige. You know, we're actually making their lives a lot better. You know, they wouldn't be doing as well if we weren't there. That's the colonial argument, which I find, you know, more than a little offensive, quite frankly. Now, I wouldn't in that argument accuse Federation people of being colonial. You know, that's just a no-win. But I have no trouble saying that here. I think it's just an offensive argument. And the other thing, I guess, related to that is these are Jewish institutions. I call them the Jewish establishment. They are not synonymous with the Jewish community. The Jewish community is much wider and more vast and more diverse than you would possibly imagine by just looking at these specific institutions. These are institutions that are not accountable to the community. They have their own agendas, they have their own boards of directors, and usually those boards of directors are the biggest donors to those organizations. They are not accountable to the community in any way. They are only accountable to themselves. So don't mistake them for the Jewish community. The Jewish community far transcends many of these organizations that get the lion's share of quotes in the press and publicity.
You're talking as examples of Jewish Federation?
The Jewish Federations, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. There's lots of these organizations that usually when the press needs a quote about what's going on in the Jewish world, they go to. But they don't represent the Jewish community. These are individual organizations within a Jewish institutional world. One of the things I mentioned I love about Jewish Voice for Peace is that it's a much more grassroots community organizing approach. It's a membership organization that is accountable to this growing number of members who elect the board and have lots of very strong chapters, regional chapters that are proliferating. I think it's a much more honest and representative way of creating community.
I received a two-page letter from college. I did Vassar College address to parents. Last week I received a two-page typewritten letter from the college I attended, Vassar, addressed to the parents and alumni, letting them know that the discussions on campus were extremely disrespectful, critical, antagonistic, very non-productive, wanting the parents and alumni to know this. Our colleges, and they said that many colleges are having these very heated, disrespectful conversations. If you've been to college, we need to address these issues.
Yeah.
And have you speak at all the colleges and
Yeah,
help the young people understand.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time in colleges. I was just at Kenyon last week, actually, and I was at UCLA in February, and I go to Loyola and DePaul in the Chicago area. I meet with students a lot, and I'm very familiar with the situation on college campuses. Disrespectful is actually, a politer way. I often hear people say Jewish students feel unsafe and they feel attacked and threatened. I think there's something very, very important going on in campuses around the country, and they need our attention and our support. I'll mention it in a few different ways. In the Jewish world, there is what's called the Open Hillel movement that you might have heard about. And this dates back a few years to when Hillel International, Hillel is the Jewish student organization. It's an international organization that places Jewish student organizations in colleges around North America and really around the world. And Hillel International came up with new guidelines that forbade Hillels from sponsoring or renting space to groups that were anti-Israel, that supported BDS, and a whole litany of things that Hillel could not do. And what that effectively did was narrowed the debate in an organization that's supposed to represent a wide tent of Jewish students to a very, very narrow sort of pro-Israel, Israel advocacy kind of program. And Hillel's, students in Hillel's are starting to rebel against this. And what happened was that at Harvard, one of the Jewish student groups there called the Progressive Jewish Alliance started this movement they called Open Hillel. And they were basically saying, we're not going to abide by these guidelines. That even if we don't agree with them, we should be having them. That there are growing numbers of Jewish students who have these ideas. There are Jews who are Zionists. There are Jewish who are non-Zionists, anti-Zionists. And they should all be welcome to have open discussion about what it means to be Jewish. That's what Hillel should be all about. Also, they pointed out that if we're not going to allow anybody who advocates for BDS to come to Hillel, well, that basically means that Hillels are not going to be able to dialogue with Palestinians on campus because just about every Palestinian supports BDS. So the Open Hillel movement gained many adherents, and then this last, I think it was October or November, Swarthmore College was the first to actually, the student board of Swarthmore unanimously voted that they're declaring themselves an Open Hillel, meaning we're not going to abide by these guidelines and that all are welcome. And Vassar was another one, actually, that declared itself an Open Hillel, which I think was a very brave thing to do. And I think there's a third, I don't know if it's Wesleyan or not, but this is a very important movement. It's not disrespectful, it's the opposite of that. This is about opening up discourse. And where else, what better place than a college campus to have these difficult conversations? Yeah, they're difficult. They may devolve into disrespect now and then. You know, that's what happens with difficult conversations. But they're conversations that need to be had and they need to be supported. And many college campuses are, the leadership of these college campuses are under a great deal of pressure to clamp down because they are dependent on donors. And so that's what you're seeing, and that's why you get letters like the ones you got. But this is a movement that's growing by leaps and bounds, and what's so heartening about it is that there are Jewish students who are fighting for the rights of Jewish BDS supporters, and just BDS in general, even if they don't agree with it themselves. They find it patronizing and disrespectful that Hillel, which is an outside organization, these are not indigenous campus organizations, they are outside institutions, who are telling them who they can and can't invite to their programs. So I find that to be very important. The other thing I'll mention is that I speak a great deal for an organization called Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, which is a very, very fast-growing organization, which is quite grassroots. It doesn't have a mother organization. It's really, they're growing up in very organic ways all over the country. And most of the invitations I get are not from Hillel, but from SJP. The Kenyan just formed a new SJP this year, and one of the interesting things I'm finding is that it's made up of Palestinians, but also many Jews, increasing numbers of Jews who find that to be a comfortable home for them on campus as Jews. In other words, they're there not because they're self-hating or because they're giving up on their Judaism or abandoning their Judaism. They're because of their Judaism. And I know this because I meet them. I met them at Kenyon. Most of the kids at SJP, I met one Palestinian student, and most of them were Jewish. So there's something very significant going on, and that's something I didn't mention in my talk. I think the sea change that's going on is going on in the younger generation. And a lot of the pushback you're seeing, like the letter you got, is from people who read the writing on the wall and see that something very significant is changing, and the future is on the side of those who are seeking justice in the Jewish community and in the wider community. And that's what gives me hope as well. I meet these young people all the time, not just on college campuses. There are kids who now have done their bar mitzvahs, and now some of them have graduated from college, and they just don't share the same assumptions about Israel that previous generations have. And they resent the implication or the demand that in order to be a good Jew, you have to toe the party line on Israel.
The letter was not attending this mother conversation. It was definitely trying to open up dialogue.
But that it should be a respectful dialogue.
All these college campuses.
Yeah, no, I think we need to have these dialogues, and they should be respectful. They're not always, but you know, all important dialogues are difficult.
Well, first of all, agree or disagree remarkable to me how current what he had to say in that book remains today. How likely is it that what you're talking about would occur without the support of the United States government? And if it is critical to the continued, as you call it, the oppression, ongoing oppression, how likely is it that that's going to change given the imbalance in the resource base of the two groups and their ability to influence United States elections?
Right. I think we spend a little bit too much time focusing on the political process right now. Right now, you're right, there is a huge imbalance in terms of the influence and in terms of the political parameters of this. You know, we have the United States, the world's only superpower, that's ostensibly the honest broker in this peace process, which has a special relationship, quote unquote, you know, an unshakable bond, as Obama recently put it, with one side, is giving, you know, billions of dollars a year to one side and not the other, in large part to give them weapons that side uses against the other side. So there's no question there's an imbalance here. But I think I would go back to what I said before, that rather than, and this is where I think one of the tactical differences I have with J Street, which is so focused on the political process, I think we give far too much credit to the politicians and not enough credit to ourselves when we focus exclusively on them. I think politics has a way of shifting over time. Today's political reality is almost always not tomorrow's political reality. We can see that historically. And one of the ways that political power shifted is through popular movements, like I mentioned with the Civil Rights Movement, for instance. I mean, there was a time in which it was politically just impossible to imagine the U.S. government passing the kinds of legislation that it did in relatively short order, actually. And we could say the same about South Africa. I mean, we were a staunch ally of the apartheid regime. And I remember vividly, I'm sure many of you do too, the anti-apartheid bill that was eventually passed. The Black Caucus was very instrumental in getting it passed. Reagan vetoed it, and they overrode his veto. And we sanctioned South Africa after years and years of being a very, very close ally. So the politics there changed as well. Why did it change? Because there was this popular movement that enlarged, not only, but in no small measure, to this movement that made it intolerable for it to continue with the status quo. And so that's why I'm not just a proponent of BDS and being part of this movement because you know, it helps us to feel good about doing something. I think it works. I think historically it's effective. And I think we can see that borne out again and again and again over history. So I'm not saying that it's not important to visit our Congress people and to let them know how we feel and to lobby, but I think we should be spending just as much time, if not more, in devoting our time and energy to the popular movement that will make it so intolerable for Israel. And they're already feeling the heat. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu spends so much time talking about it. They're devoting, you know, they're making within Israel the promotion of BDS illegal. They are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars in propaganda to fight BDS on college campuses and other venues. They're taking this very, very seriously. And the reason they're taking it seriously is because they know it has very real power to isolate them in the international community. And it already is, especially in Europe. We can see that it's gaining traction, and it's starting to gain traction in this country as well. I recommend to you Ali Abunimah's new book, if you haven't read it yet, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, where his basic thesis is that Palestinians are winning. That's the opening sentence in the book. And he says that might sound totally crazy, but I think when we look at the big picture, Israel understands that it is increasingly becoming isolated and that it will not be able to act with impunity in quite the same way. And that will have to affect our government's eventually support for that country to make it very, very difficult for us to treat Israel as the staunch ally that we always have. I'll just end with one final observation. I remember right after Mandela died, I was watching on YouTube the video of his first visit to the United States after he was released from prison. It was on Nightline. It was a town meeting that Ted Koppel hosted, and it was held in a huge college auditorium. And apartheid had not yet fallen, but there was great hope, and there was momentum moving in that direction. And I remember at one point, there was a discussion about the sanctions that were still being applied against South Africa. And Mandela was making a strong plea to keep the sanctions on. It's not the time to let up until apartheid falls. And then they opened it up to question and answer, and this Republican congressman, it might have even been a senator, got up, Republican, and said, "We stand with you, Mr. Mandela, and I agree that we must, in Congress, we must keep these sanctions on until this unjust regime," I'm not embellishing, "this unjust regime finally falls. That is the way we will find justice in this struggle." This was a Republican politician who, just not that many years before, would, in public, to say such things about this country that was at one time a major intelligence and military ally of our country. Shows just how, it was breathtaking to me to see that. And it reminded me that what seems politically intractable now is not necessarily the case down the line. And sometimes it just takes that one domino to fall, and we see it can happen very quickly, as it did in the case of South Africa. So that's my long-winded answer.
Thank you, Rabbi, for being a voice of conscience. With the continued settlement expansion, the two-state solution is becoming less and less viable. So we're left with two alternatives. One is binational state, whereby there are equal rights for all citizens, or one state with different laws for different citizens, hence apartheid. Neither of these two options are attractive to the Israelis or even to the American Jewish community. Now, my question is, why can't the AIPAC and other political action groups in this country that are heavily influencing U.S. foreign policy, why can't realize that this is not the best for Israel? George W. Bush said it many times, and Obama said it more than once, that two-state solution is in Israel's long-term interest. Why can't the political action groups realize that and maybe save Israel from its actions?
So, it's interesting, I think, with the fall of the latest iteration of the peace process, and we're hearing interesting things coming out of Washington. We heard Kerry use very, very strong words to describe what's going on. He used the word apartheid. He said, Israel's going down a path that will lead it toward apartheid. This is something that Secretary of State of our government used the A word finally. I'm reading reports, off-the-record reports of American figures in the State Department and diplomats who are basically putting the onus on Israel for the current state of affairs and saying they're basically committing national suicide. And it's that door is closing, if not already closed. So there's two sides to that. One is we should not discount the incredibly intolerable situation it creates for the Palestinians on the ground. There's no question. But in a way, I welcome it because it makes the question, it's not an academic question anymore. You put it perfectly. It's a choice. We have a choice. Whether you think that the two-state solution is rapidly becoming impossible, or you believe that door is already closed. I personally am in the second camp, but that's beside the point. I think the question is, you put it very well. We have a question between an apartheid state and a state of all its citizens. Which are you going to choose? I welcome that question. I think we should have that question. I think we should ask it to every member of the Jewish community. We should ask it to AIPAC. We should ask it to every person of good faith who's involved in this, who has a stake in this, the solution to this conflict. All right. Well, look what's happened. We have a question now. We have a question before us. There's no more two-state solution. That's become impossible. It's a choice between two one-state solutions. Which do you choose? Let's put that question out there. I think we should be asking that question to everyone. So the question to me is not why will they not listen? I think we need to raise that question more and more so that we force people to realize the stakes. I have no problem saying it. it's a no-brainer. I vastly prefer a state of all its citizens to an apartheid Jewish state. And I defy anyone of good conscience to say otherwise. So I think tactically, it's to our advantage to have that situation, to have that question forced in a very real way and not a theoretical way. Granted that living under the apartheid conditions that Palestinians are living now is intolerable, and I don't want to, underestimate that for a second.
Let's say thank you. I know that there are still some folks who want to engage with you, and so I would invite you to engage with Rabbi Rosen over here in the Folsom room. He'll be hanging out over there, and I invite you to come over and join us for some sweets and treats and conversation with each other and with Rabbi Rosen in just a minute. Thank you all for being here today. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon and evening, and I personally am grateful, and we at Indiana Center for Middle East Peace are grateful for your presence today, and Rabbi, of course, for your coming and your insights. So thank you very much. I want to remind you about Sunday, June the 8th, and we'll get more information out to you. If you want to know about our programs, and if you're not receiving our emails, please sign up in the Folsom room. Next on my list, a year from this coming summer, in 2015, June 2015, there is our 10th Study in Solidarity tour to Israel and Palestine. And in July 2015, our trip to Mystical Turkey. And so if you're interested in either one of those trips, we have information on them on our table in the Folsom room. And finally, I just want to say that we can't do what we do here without your generous support, both being here, your presence, but as well as your financial support. So I'd encourage you to, if you're moved to do so, to make an offering for us in one of the boxes on our table in the Folsom room as you join us afterwards. Thank you all for being here today. Rabbi, I'm going to get you to scoot on over there pretty quickly so that we can have conversations with you over there. And thank you all for being here today.